Great, Larry. Thanks so much for chairing this, and thanks for the very good coverage on the Guardian Development blog this morning. It's a real pleasure to be here among so many friends, but also particularly in partnership with Oxfam, who I have the great honour to be a trustee of. I was at the Arms Trade Treaty celebration event at the Foreign Office last night, and it was incredibly moving to see such a fantastic success after 20 years of campaigning. And it's part of a whole series of successes that Oxfam continues to have all the time. It's also a real pleasure to be doing this at ODI, because I think 25 years ago I was a researcher at ODI and have had a very close working relationship with ODI ever since. So it's really nice to be doing this here. Let me also just say before I start a really huge thank you to the team at DFI, Development Finance International, especially Richard Watts, who's headed the whole data part, without which none of this would have been possible, and the team at Oxfam for all of the preparation and all of the real support on this, and to ODI for supporting with this event. So why are we here? What are we talking about? Okay, so what is Government Spending Watch? Let me start with a few words on that. So it's a partnership between Oxfam International and Development Finance International to monitor, analyse, advocate and campaign for both increased developing country spending and on-budget aid for the development goals. And Larry referred to the MDGs, but this project is designed to look well beyond those to the post-2015 goals as well. And I think Phil's going to talk particularly about that, but also to take account of countries' own national goals. And secondly, for increased transparency and accessibility of data and documents on such spending, which fits into all the various global movements for government transparency and open budgets. What are we actually going to do? Well, what we have done is to compile a freely available to everybody database of spending on these goals. There are 52 countries online at the moment, and I can show you on the map what those are. All that map I won't go into detail because it's in the report that I think you've all got a copy of, or you can find online. And there are going to be another 34 covered fairly soon. And it contains budgets between 2008 and 2012, as well as actual spending. We're going to be putting up online soon 2013 budgets, so it's pretty much real-time data as soon as the budgets get approved. And where countries have done them, forecast through to 2015. And it's split up by recurrent and investment spending, the funding source, whether it's the government's own revenue or donor aid, and it's presented in various ways to help people analyse and campaign. This has all come, the number one question I get asked everywhere is, how have you managed to do this? Partly because none of the international organisations which you might have expected to do this have done it. And the answer is that we were, for 10 years, funded, including by DFID, to work with all of the heavily indebted poor countries to help them get their debt relief under the HIPC debt relief programme. And as a result of that, we have very close relationships with the governments and particularly the budget directors. And in many cases, we help them put together their poverty-related spending for their PRSPs, if anybody still remembers what those are, because most people don't have them anymore. As a result, they were prepared to work with us to get us access to documents which were semi-accessible, or annexes of documents, or spreadsheets that they had, so none of this is confidential, but it took a huge amount of work to actually get it all together. Then beyond the data, there's this annual report, which you've all had a copy of, and there's a lot of other analysis of sectors or other issues which is available on the website. And probably the most fundamental thing is this is not just about producing reports and data. This is about promoting campaigning and advocacy at global, regional and national levels for more spending and transparency. I think Phil and Toko will talk more about that because they're going to be taking the lead role in that part of the partnership. All of this is being coordinated via a website, which is www.governmentspendingwatch.org, which has everything on it. And Richard Watts, if you could just indicate who you are, Richard, so people can see you, will be leading, for those of you who are more interested in actually seeing what the website contains, what the data contains, he'll be leading a session on the other side of the corridor at 2:15 for you to see a bit more. So what have we found? Well, it is a bit amazing that 12 years after the MDGs, this is the first ever report to actually track how much developing countries are spending on them in their budgets in this kind of a comprehensive way. We're going to be doing, as I said, it covers 52 countries at the moment. We're going to be doing 34. We've also just recently had suggested to us by one potential funder that we might like to do all of the emerging market G20 members, which would take us to 42. And indeed, we have partly for Toko, helped to put together some South African data in the last week or two, so that will be going up on the site fairly soon. And it covers 7 sectors in which we have isolated the Global Development Goal spending. The report talks about whether the data are accessible. It talks about overall trends in countries' budgets, how much revenue they're getting, how much they're spending, how it's being paid for. It talks about trends in overall MDG spending and for each of the sectors, and talks about whether countries are meeting the targets that have been set or the promises they've made. And it also talks, I think, very importantly about the, in some cases, rather distortionary impact of aid and some of the issues relating to medium-term and long-term sustainability which that produces. So let me deal with those each in turn. First of all, the data. This kind of cascades down. Richard has a wonderful diagram which he's going to show later on, which shows you this much more clearly than I'm about to say it. But anyway, for the total spending, we have pretty much every piece of data that's necessary. For the sector data, which we're using for judging whether countries are living up to their commitments, we have a very high proportion, although it's much less good on water and sanitation, known as WASH by those in the field, and gender. When you get down to the more detailed stuff, which you would need to go beyond the basic campaigning on our countries living up to their promises, it becomes more difficult. So only half of the countries have sector-level data split up by recurrent investment spending, and only a third by the funding source. And one very important thing which comes up again and again in this presentation is it's almost impossible for governments to be transparent about these things if donors are not being transparent to them. And in this particular case, a lot of countries leave the aid out of their budgets because donors don't report it to them. And actually we found there were 8 fragile states where there is no $1 of on-budget aid because donors are doing everything off budget. So that brings us again to another map which is in the report that shows you the relative share of data that we have for countries. And it may look quite low, but actually, as I said, for the data we need to do the analysis in the report, it's quite high, but there is a long way to go on the transparency front as well. So the recommendation in the report is about having much more accessibility of data, much more donor reporting, making this a part of budget transparency campaigns. We've had very good discussions with IBP and other people on that, and part of the monitoring the post-2015 goals. What are the overall budget trends? Well, compared to the projections which were being made before the global economic crisis, poor countries have lost $140 billion of budget revenues and therefore of potential spending on the MDGs. But they have, as many of you will know, been growing pretty rapidly, recovering pretty fast from that crisis, and been making very strong efforts themselves, which are sometimes missed at the global level, to increase their own revenue. And so many have been able to achieve the kind of magic trick of reducing their deficits and their aid dependence at the same time as increasing their spending on these goals. But there are a minority, I would say about 30%, who've been really hard hit by the global economic crisis and other climate or conflict shocks, and their GDP is stagnating, spending being cut pretty hard. So we talk about the need to have even more revenue effort by the countries themselves, but also for OECD countries to really put their money where their mouths are in the discussion about revenues at the moment. And you know, I was aware recently of one OECD country whose foreign minister was standing up and saying that they should be, the country, a particular country in Africa, should be getting much more revenue to its budget, and why were they so aid dependent, at the same time as their trade and industry minister was in the country lobbying for a sweetheart tax deal for a mineral company from their country. So, you know, perhaps a little more coherence on the donor side is called for too. In terms of the international community's role in actually helping countries fight the crisis and spend more, the conclusion is that aid grants came too little and too late to fill the budget hole or accelerate MDG progress. So 40% of that extra spending has been funded by debt, and including very large new off-budget financing for infrastructure, sort of private financing initiatives of the type that our own Treasury Select Committee in this country has condemned as being an exceedingly expensive way of doing things, but they're happening very widely in developing countries now. And it was interesting, I was in Berlin the week before last at a World Bank debt management conference where people were concluding that debt burdens are rising very fast again and being used as a reason for countries to cut spending again, as they have been in the past. So, you know, what does that imply? That implies, okay, strong country debt management policies and a very strict control of off-budget infrastructure financing, but also the implication on the international community to make sure that there's enough grants and loans out there to keep the spending on the MDGs going. I won't deal in particular with the IMF issue. We've dealt with this in a lot of reports before, but just to say that the IMF, countries with IMF programs have a less positive spending position in terms of the percentage of their GDP they're spending on these goals. And if the fall that's projected for next year takes place, they'll be almost back to the same level they were in 2008, where the other countries are still spending quite a lot more. On overall MDG spending, as I said, many countries are spending more than ever before in real terms on the MDGs, and that's really good news. You often hear at the international level this debate saying, have the MDGs had any impact? And the answer is clearly yes. There's really strong government and citizens' commitment to the MDGs, as I think we'll hear from Toko. You know, people have used the MDGs to campaign for higher levels of spending. But there are quite a few countries which are seeing stagnant or reduced spending and much less progress. And then when you look at the targets that people have set, which are set as a percentage of GDP or the total spending, it looks a lot less positive. So MDG spending has risen by only 0.5% of GDP since 2008 and has fallen by 1% of total spending. And it really seems incumbent on everybody to redouble their efforts to improve their monitoring and increase the level of MDG spend and incorporate analysis of those data in all the different MDG progress reports. So very briefly on the targets and whether countries are meeting them, the answer is they're not on the whole. It's described in much more detail in the report and in this lovely postcard that Oxfam have put together, which most of you should have had as well. But essentially, we would have loved to have a green cell in that table, which would have meant that everybody was meeting the target and or making progress towards it, but there ain't no green ones. So the yellow ones mean that a very small proportion of countries are meeting the target and the spending trends are stagnant, and the red ones, notably social protection, means that no country is meeting the target that they've set themselves and the trends are backwards. So there are huge spending gaps for the MDGs, but as I think Phil is going to focus on, the trends are even less positive for what you might call the post-2015 agenda. If we think that that agenda is going to be about social protection against inequality, about still dealing with food and hunger, about environment and climate change, about empowering women beyond education, those are the sectors where those cells are pretty much red rather than yellow. And it does seem absolutely vital that every country should have in its budget statement, as Rwanda already does, a statement of whether it's meeting its targets and commitments, and that we need some targets for gender and environment and climate change, because those are the countries where, those are the sectors where the least spending is taking place, and talking to people, they feel that there would be a great deal more pressure on people to spend more if there were at least some targets to meet. Very briefly, some other findings on aid, and we're really only scratching the surface of what can be done, and encourage everybody in this room to do their own analysis of what's on the database as well. The impact of aid. What we've found is some really interesting patterns, notably a very high degree of aid dependency for agriculture and WASH. And then we compared these numbers with the education and, well, with the DAC numbers for what's called country programmable aid, which is the nearest you can get to what actually reaches the country in terms of DAC aid. And we found that a very high percentage of education and health aid is off budget, which means it's really undermining government accountability to its citizens. And we also found that there's virtually no aid going to the post-2015 areas. There's a little bit going to social protection, but mostly for emergencies or for post-emergency situations. And virtually none going for climate change and the environment, and very little for gender either. So there is obviously a need for there to be an increase in real aid in the next few years, and the obvious funding source for that is innovative financing, financial transaction taxes, and so forth. But also a need for donors to improve accountability by bringing their aid on budget and give much more priority to post-2015. We also have a set of measures that we recommend for countries to actually convince donors to bring their money on budget as well. And then that sort of pattern of aid translates into other findings as well. So there's woefully insufficient recurrent spending, especially in water and sanitation and agriculture. And if we're going to sort that problem out, we need countries to have higher revenue mobilization and donors to give more aid to recurrent spending through sector program or budget support. There's quite big implementation problems, notably, interestingly enough, in the agriculture and water and sanitation sector. So we thought, well, does that actually prove what recipient countries often say, which is that it may be donor aid that's causing most of the delays in implementation, but in any case, everybody needs to simplify and accelerate their procedures. And then we looked at the medium-term forecast through to 2015 and found that they were all showing either stagnant or falling spending. And that's partly due to donors not living up to their Busan commitment to report what they're planning to do for the next 3 years. And so we recommend that that needs to be implemented. Finally, just to conclude, I think the overall message of the report is that if we're not careful, the planned spending cuts and the already being implemented aid falls could really end an age of rapid MDG progress and strangle post-2015 goals at birth. And at the same time, we've got online the UN's World We Want survey, which is showing just how passionately committed the citizens across the world are to achieving these goals before and after 2015. And yet governments, especially donors, and the international community are not delivering. We did a pre-launch of this in the US a few weeks ago, and somebody actually said, isn't this a bit like the whole guns issue? The whole country wants there to be some action on guns, but somehow the system can't get their act together to actually deliver on that. And I think it is a very good parallel. And so this report is really the first step in a huge effort, in partnership, I hope, with all of you, to really have a massive global campaign and mobilization to increase spending on these goals and to ensure that we do get the world that we've all said we want.
Thank you very much, Matthew. Plenty of food for thought there. Some questions I've got, which I'll come back to later. But Phil, perhaps you could take up the baton and explain why this is important to Oxfam, what it means for your advocacy and your programmes ahead.